You're listening to the RHE Global podcast. I'm your host, Jim Nixon. I'm the product owner of the Noise app here at RHE Global, but I've got an extensive background in antisocial behaviour. And these are a special set of podcasts that I'm putting together for ASB Awareness Week that runs from the 30th of June all the way through the week. So I'm putting together some podcasts that are just looking at some of the key aspects around antisocial behaviour, some of the challenges and how we can sort of work together to try and make our communities a safer place to be. So I've been involved in community safety for 30 years this year, and when I was a police officer, I was a police officer for nearly 21 years. One of the big issues that I came across on my neighbourhoods when I was a neighbourhood sergeant was the issue of nuisance motorbikes, off-road bikes as they're sometimes referred to. And I've done a lot of work in this particular area, and it's not an easy issue to tackle. I think it causes a lot of distress for communities. It's a big issue, not just around the noise, but also the risk that it presents to members of the public, whether that be on our pavements, on our roads, on our green spaces. It's a major issue. And as I said, it's not one that is easily solved. So we're going to have a look at what the issue is. We're going to look at the main sort of challenges that we face. We're going to look at what the current legislation says, and then we're going to just look at some potential solutions. I haven't got a magic wand. And as a lot of police services will tell you and partners will tell you, this is not an easy issue to tackle. But I think over my career, we've had an element of success. And I think it's about balancing enforcement with other options as well, particularly when you've got young people riding these machines. So we're going to have a look at that. So let's set the scene. Why are we here? Why are we talking about this? It affects so many people across our towns and cities in the UK, and no doubt further afield. You've got the roar of engines tearing through residential streets, public parks and footpaths. And of course, as I've said, they're not just noisy, they're dangerous. They're often ridden illegally, without helmets, insurance, or even roadworthiness. Some of these vehicles that I've seized over the years are in a really poor state. They're literally falling apart. They are dangerous machines, and they need to be taken out of circulation. Again, it's not uncommon, as I found to my cost the other day when a reckless rider was riding towards me down a normal street. I was in my vehicle and he's doing a wheelie towards me, losing control of the bike. Luckily, managed to sort of right it at the last minute. But, a very scary moment for me. And you wonder how that individual's going to be riding that bike later on, and the risk and the harm he's put into other members of the community. It's very easy to evade the police and intimidate pedestrians. And again, the impact is making people feel really unsafe within their own communities. And I think sometimes we feel a little bit powerless to sort of stop the problem. I've talked to a number of residents, that said that they won't let their children play out, even, during safe times of the day, because of the worry that they have. Even when they're going to parks, in open spaces. I've got an open space at the top of my road, and sometimes, it's blighted by motorbikes, off-road bikes zooming sort of on that field, and the danger and the risks, to members of the public and their animals when they're walking dogs. So it is a major issue. So what are our main challenges faced by communities and the police? So let's have a look. First up, enforcement. Many of these bikes are unregistered. They've got no number plates, making them sort of nearly impossible to track. Some are stolen, and many are stored in hidden garages, estates, and they are passed around. They're very easy to source, these bikes. And one of the issues I've found with young people in particular is I've found that the parents or carers tend to be involved in sourcing some of these vehicles, and they kind of give them consent to go out and use these vehicles. And that is a real problem, because when you are looking at, say, for example, tackling that issue with that young person, you then meet the resistance of the parent or the carer, and that can be, again, a major challenge for the police and other partners when we're trying to tackle this issue. Police pursuit policies add another complication. Forces often won't chase these riders, and I don't blame them because of the risks involved. And I certainly don't want to put members of the public at risk when they're being chased by the police. And, there's a lot of dangers to the rider as well, in terms of they're not wearing helmets, they're not wearing safety equipment. So there's this risk of harm, and it's just simply too high for the police to chase these individuals in many circumstances. So we've got to look at alternatives. And I think also, residents sometimes may be reluctant to report some of these incidents out of fear of retaliation. I think there's a real sense that nothing gets done, which only sort of increases the opportunities for those offenders. What does the current legislation say? What does the law say? Let's break it down in terms of off-road bikes can only be used on private land with the landowner's permission. Riding them on pavements, parks, public roads without insurance obviously is illegal. The main legislation that we use when we're tackling these particular issues are the Road Traffic Act 1988 for offences like no insurance, driving without a licence. And then you've got Section 59 of the Police Reform Act 2002. This gives police powers to seize the vehicles using antisocial behaviour in an antisocial manner. One thing I would say about this, and what I've come across in my experience with this particular issue, is that what some areas will do is they will put the Section 59 notices up on lampposts or other kind of locations. And what they've kind of got into their sort of mindset then is, because the notices are up and these riders are aware that if we catch them on the bike, then the Section 59 legislation is in play. What I would say is, in my interpretation of this, and talking to some individuals that are involved in this on a regular basis, my interpretation and my best practices is that you have to serve a Section 59 notice on that rider on the first instance, and it's on the rider, not on the vehicle. As we've already said, vehicles are very difficult to sort of identify, so it's placed on the rider. And if, again, best practice would be to put that information onto the police national computer, and then when that is all in place, if that rider is then caught again on another vehicle or the same vehicle, then you're in a great position then to be able to look to seize that vehicle. So it's just something to bear in mind. If you are a practitioner listening to this, then it always is best practice to be able to serve that notice on the individual. So just a little bit of guidance there around that. You've also got the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014. You've got community protection warnings and notices that can be issued to persistent offenders 16 or over. So you've got that legislation as well. But again, what I would say with that, in my experience, is if you're going to use that legislation, then make sure you follow through when you do get breaches of that legislation. And we are going to be covering community protection notices during this series as well. So we will cover that with Liz Smith from Resolve ASB. And we're going to be looking at that in a bit more detail later on this week. And then you can also look at the Theft Act 1968, I believe, where bikes obviously are stolen. Sort of basic common sense, really. If you've got the a vehicle that's suspected stolen, then you can use the Theft Act as well. And then finally, local councils can impose what we call public space protection orders to restrict the use of certain areas by vehicles. But again, enforcement relies heavily on resources and public reporting. If I'm being honest with you, in my experience of implementing PSPOs, it's not something I would do straight away. I would look at lots of different options first before I sort of, dived into a PSPO. They are very, very bureaucratic. They are very admin intense, and they need to be reviewed every 12 months and then formally every 3 years. So they are a lot of work for local authorities and also the police, because they will clearly be involved in all the key partners. So we will maybe do a podcast on this in the future around PSPOs. And again, it's another option that you could potentially look at. So there is some legislation that we can use. But what can be done in real time? What do we feel that can be done? From my experience, as I've said earlier in the podcast, there's no single fix for this issue. It really is a complex issue and something that can't be solved very, very quickly. What I've seen in my time is targeted operations with the police, where, police-led. A lot of UK regions do this now. tackle known hotspots. And what a lot of police services are doing now as well is using drones as a much safer way to sort of track the offender, to be able to identify who they are. Appreciate that's not always easy, but again, you can track and record clothing, the build of that individual, the approximate age. So it does give you evidence, even if you don't catch them at that time, to be able to then look at that from an investigative point of view and identify those individuals. So I am an advocate of that. I think the problem is it's such a widespread issue across UK policing is really around funding, and so many areas are requesting the use of the drones and the use of maybe some police areas that have got the use of their own off-road bikes. It's really just around having that sort of focus on one particular area to be able to sort of tackle the problem effectively. There's no point for me seeing an operation here one day and then you're not going to see that operation there then for another few months. So I think it does need that kind of, prolonged intensity, and I think that is a problem within UK policing at the moment because of the funding issues and just the general demand on police service. So that can be an issue. But if it's well coordinated, it can be really positive. One of the things I implemented with particularly young people was acceptable behaviour contracts. Now, this isn't legally binding, but what I used to do is enter into acceptable behaviour contracts with those young people. In a number of cases, we actually did get the parents or carers to voluntarily give up the bikes, and we would work with those young people with other partners like the youth offending service. There's nothing to stop you referring a young person to youth offending before they get into the criminal justice system, and I think actually that's a plus, because I'm all about prevent. I want to get as many young people referred, looked at, some work done with them to stop them going down that criminal justice route. That's the last thing you want. We don't want some of these young people that are causing problems on off-road bikes today to be our sort of seasoned criminals tomorrow. So I do feel that a lot of work needs to be done at that early stage, rather than, that person becomes, a lifelong criminal, in and out of prison, massive drain on society. And ultimately, their life is not in a great place. Early intervention is a big one for me. So acceptable behaviour contracts, a great one. But again, if you're a practitioner listening to this, no point just doing an ABC, as we call them, and forgetting about it. It does have to be monitored and it does have to be reviewed. And even my team, and again, I appreciate police resources, but it was really good to be able to kind of visit the young person at home. When you do the ABC meetings, get the parents or carers involved, get other key partners involved, and make it a real robust process. And I think what I saw was a real huge success. We had about 70 young people on these contracts, but we never saw any go to that sort of formal sort of criminal justice or enforcement. So I think they've got real opportunity with this option to be able to sort of help with this problem of off-road bikes, but again, it's not going to sort of solve it 100%. One of the things that I did when I worked for a local authority, and I know I've touched on this at the moment, already, around members of the public not always wanting to come forward and give information, but I do think community intelligence is worthwhile when you are trying to tackle this issue. Community are the people on the ground. They see an awful lot more than the police, and they get to know an awful lot. So one of the things I did when I worked up at a local authority in the North Midlands was we set up an operation called Operation Transom. Now, we would still do the targeted operations, but what this did was it encouraged members of the public to contact the local authority, and they could leave information anonymously, a bit like Crime Stoppers. So they didn't have to give information in terms of their name, their address, so they could leave information anonymously. And what we wanted to know really was, who were the riders? Where were they riding the bikes? Where were they storing the bikes? As much information as they would give us. And then we would work closely with the police and follow up on that information. And again, I felt it was important to run that through the local authority rather than the police, so that what I found was sometimes there was a confidence actually from members of the community reporting it to the local authority, rather than through the police or rather than through Crime Stoppers. Not that I'm saying that is not a great route as well, but it just was something that I found when I was dealing with these potential witnesses that were at their wits' end. They just seem to have that confidence in reporting it to the local authority. So Operation Transom has been a great success. And it continues to run to this day. It involves a lot of awareness. So we had some posters made up and some leaflets and some big sort of boards that we would like put up in places like Tesco's and all the main supermarkets. So as people walked into the store, they could see what it was all about, and they would see the number or the email address that they could contact us on. And then leave. And there was like a 24-hour answering service, so they could leave a message on that answering service any time. So that's always a good option. And I think it works well in addition to some of the other sort of measures that we can sort of put in place when we're tackling this issue. I've already really touched on education and diversion, but youth programs offering sort of legal off-road riding, mechanical skill workshops or track access. I say that very lightly because we know resources are tight in the 21st century. We did have a scheme when I worked in the West Midlands that did have a track, and they did have this kind of scheme, but I have to say they are few and far between. But having said that, I do think these kind of schemes can work, not with every young person, not with everyone involved in these kind of offences, but they do go a long way to sort of diverting those young people. And again, it might be that it doesn't have to be specifically linked to off-road bikes. Again, it can be other type of diversionary opportunities as well. But again, I'm a realist, and I know youth services have been cut to the bone in a lot of areas across the UK. So it's not something that is going to be implemented or the facilities are going to be there. We are in major challenging times. So again, I understand that it's not always easy, and I don't want anybody listening to this podcast saying, oh yeah, simple answer, Jim, that's not going to work. What I'm saying to you is it does work, but we've got to find ways in making it work, whether that be through the voluntary sector or more provisions provided by local authorities as we move forward. Because again, it comes back to me to that early intervention. There's no point putting all this money into kind of offender management when we can put a lot of time, effort and that money into preventing, and that goes across the board, not just with sort of off-road bikes. It's a major issue, and I think there's real sort of legs in that early intervention kind of work, and I'm a big advocate of it. And then my main one really is good quality partnership. When I was a police officer, I couldn't do it without the local authority and the local housing association that was firmly active within the area. But I do see an awful lot of partners working together, but it's not true partnership working. So I am a big believer that if you're going to work in partnership, then it's got to be a shared responsibility. You've all got to work together. You can't just rely on one partner like the police and expect them to do everything. You've got to hold people accountable. And there are skill areas that some partners can bring to the table a hell of a lot better than others. So it is about sort of working really closely in partnership and making sure that, as I say, people are held accountable. You hold, regular meetings, but when you go away from those meetings, you're clear on who has got what actions. And when they come back, or they have a timeline to report back, that they report back and, we see some action. I've seen it too many times when those actions just aren't completed. And in my experience, a lot of responsibility will fall onto the police. It's got to be a shared responsibility. And I think my experiences in West Midlands and also in the North Midlands was very much that collective partnership, making sure that meetings were robustly chaired by a chairperson that had, was strong and could, hold people accountable. And I think when you get that and you get willing individuals, then you can go a long way to tackling some of the problems. Again, I'm a realist, it's not easy, but it can be achieved. So partnership is massive for me. When councils, police, housing associations, youth workers collaborate, we can see some quite amazing work. And I'm speaking from experience here. I've seen this happen and I know it can work. And the way I look at it, let's work on a success rate of 1. If we can get one young person or one person offending onto that sort of right path, for me, that's got to be a success. And when you look at the knock-on effect of just one offender and the costs involved and the impact it has on communities' lives, it's got to be a no-brainer for me. So that is something that, I'm a massive advocate of. So let's just wrap up. Nuisance bikes are more than just a loud annoyance. They're a genuine safety and social issue. Tackling them requires a joint effort from law enforcement, communities, and even riders themselves. So if you're listening to this and you're a member of the public, then I would say please report it. You can do that anonymously. You don't have to give your details. There are organisations like Crime Stoppers where you can leave that information anonymously. Some areas might have projects, operations up and running like Operation Transom that I've already mentioned. Again, look into your local areas and see what is available and see if you can leave that information anonymously. It can then be picked up and looked at and assessed, and then if there's real sort of credence in that information, which I'm sure it will be, then we can look to act on that information. So please report it, because if you don't report it, then this problem's not going to get fixed, and it isn't going to get fixed anytime soon. But the more help that we can get from the community, the more we've got a much better chance of tackling the issue. And then what I would say to practitioners is, make sure that you're aware of what powers and tools and the law that you're working with. As I've said already, sometimes I've seen some issues around the Section 59 notices and how they're implemented. And, if you're going to get a legal challenge, you probably find that just the notices alone are not sufficient. So make yourself aware of all the tools and powers that you've got available to you. And just see if you can be creative with those tools and powers. It's amazing the sort of things that you can come up with within the law and within the processes that just may help tackle that issue. What I'm going to be doing at RHE over the next few months is putting together a training course very much aimed at tackling this issue. So we're going to be looking at the legislation, we're going to be looking at some of the options, and also providing some great case studies from around the country showing what works and what doesn't work. So if you are interested and you're a practitioner, then look out on the RHE Global website. So that's www.rheglobal.com, and then you'll find a training section on that website. We will be advertising that course probably from September onwards. So please look out for that. And that will be open to all practitioners, police, community safety practitioners in local authorities, youth workers, whoever has an interest in tackling the sort of nuisance stroke off-road bikes. The course will be open to you. And I think you'll find it really interesting. And what I also find with these courses is I'm there as the trainer, as the facilitator. But what's great is when we get lots of individuals from different organisations and they're sharing that information when they're doing group work, and they're talking to each other. In a lot of cases, they follow through after the courses and obviously keep contacting each other after as well. So it's really great when that happens, and I think that's what we need to be able to solve this problem longer term. So look out for that course. As I say, we're going to be doing a series of these over the week around different antisocial behaviour issues and how we can potentially tackle them. But thank you for listening today. I hope you found this useful, and I will catch you on the next episode.